talk to the person. That's the most important thing. They need to feel comfortable. The worst thing is when a person is just pointing a big ass camera at you, turning a few buttons, looking at the picture, looking back at you. You think, am I doing something wrong, or is he just trying to figure it out? So communication is the biggest thing. That's going to instantly put them at ease. And that's when you're going to get some of the good portraits outside.
Hello everyone and welcome to Canon Conversations, the show where I sit down with some of the top creatives in the industry so that you can become a bit better photographer. On today's show, we are starting a 3-part series in everything you need to know on portrait photography. Today's show, we're going to be starting with the basics. You know, if you're an absolute beginner with your camera, we're going to walk you through how you can take a beautiful photo of someone. And over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be ramping up the skill level to take you from an absolute beginner through to a working professional. And to guide us on our journey over the next 3 weeks, we have fashion and portrait photographer Anupam Singh. Anupam, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me. I'm really grateful to be on here. And I wish there was something like this when I was starting out, because this gives a really good insight. And you get to meet all the creatives virtually, and especially in times like this. And it's really good to just learn off each other, and especially coming in after the interview with Sasha and Liam. That was really insightful, and I really admire their work. So thank you for having me.
Oh, fantastic, man. Appreciate the feedback. Yeah, it's a fantastic time to be a creative coming up. You've just got this wealth of knowledge for free on the internet. I mean,
Yes.
like that's how I learned photography and filmmaking, is just through going on YouTube and figuring it all out and listening to podcasts and tutorials and things like that. So it's how a lot of people are learning their craft these days.
It has been really good. I'm self-taught, and I started in 2010. And for me, it was more about reading books, because YouTube wasn't that big back then. And there were very few creatives who were sharing what they're doing. It was just Chase Jarvis and a few like that who was sharing behind the scenes and how you get to do it. So for me, it was reading a lot of books and getting insights into what photographers did back then. But now there are no gatekeepers, and there's knowledge everywhere you look around, and it's probably the best time to be a creative.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great way to segue into today's kind of topic is of the beginners for the beginners. An absolute basics of a sort of how to take a great portrait photo, and so I really wanted to sort of just break it down for people who've sort of got their first DSLR, their first mirrorless camera. I think the place to start might be with composition, because it's an area of photography that it's relatively easy to understand. It's kind of the first thing that people start to figure out when they're sort of translating their 3D world into a 2D plane, looking through a viewfinder or looking on a screen.
Perfect. As
they start to move it around, the idea of composition is kind of the first skill that comes up, really. And the idea of composition and portraits goes kind of all the way back to the Renaissance, really. The head and shoulders, the slightly the tilt. There's also all these sorts of tropes that have been carried on through the centuries. And so, can you start to give us a bit of a real sort of basics 101 on composition in portrait photography?
Sure thing, Ben. That's a really good question. And like you mentioned, portraiture has been going on since we remember it, and it's been documented throughout. And it hasn't changed much when you look at it. It's usually the shoulder and up, directional lighting, or it's the clamshell lighting, which we'll get into more in a later stage. But I think you can divide a good portraiture and a good portrait photographer into 2 parts. First one being technical side of things. You really need to understand your camera. When you turn up on a day and say, I'm taking a portrait of you, I can't be looking at my camera fumbling around where aperture is and where my f-stop needs to be and what my shutter speed needs to be. I need to be talking to you. And that's the second part, that understand your subject, know where the portrait is going to go. Just because you like to shoot black and white, moody portraits, that doesn't mean it's going to work for a business or a person. So knowing what what the customer or your portrait, whoever you're taking a portrait of, needs is the first part. And knowing your camera is the other important bit. And then coming on to basically your camera. So any camera is good to start off with. So I recommend, or I try and use any lenses that are more than 50 millimeters long. or longer from there. Because when you're shooting at 24, you really get the lens distortion, and that's going to make your face look wider. Your person is going to look extra tall or extra wide. So you kind of want to stay at the 50 millimeter focal length and anything above that. And that gives you that nice distortion on the face. So that's one of the tips I would say. Try and start with a 50 millimeter. And no matter what brand of camera you're shooting, you can always pick up a cheap 50 millimeter.
Yeah. And so I kind of want to sort of delve into that point you just made there, because it's a tip that comes across, I'm sure anyone who's spent a decent amount of time looking on YouTube or anywhere for basic photography tips, everyone says first lens you get is a 50mm. But a lot of those tips are given by pro photographers who are using full frame bodies. And a lot of people start out not using a full frame. So
full frame body.
Does the adage of starting with a 50mm still hold true? Because on a 50mm on a crop sensor is basically an 85.
Yeah, pretty much. It's almost like that 80 millimeter focal length.
Yeah.
The thing you want to start there is because that's a cheap entry into it. A 50 millimeter 1.8 would cost you about $180, $200. I know someone's going to correct us in the comments, but that's what they usually go for.
Yeah.
And that's a good entry point to start. You go to a 35mm, which becomes a 50 on a crop, the price just straight away doubles. So is that price enough for you to walk back 2 steps and recompose? Or are you going to pay the double the amount just to get the 35 because that's a 50 on your APS-C camera? So it comes to that price versus the lens.
Absolutely. But it's I guess an aspect of that conversation that I don't hear come up a lot is that the people who are using 50mm and say use a 50mm are using that on a full frame body, and so that is sort of taking the price out of it, obviously, because the whole 50mm is the cheapest prime, and it is a great way to enter into the world of fixed focal lengths affordably. But taking pricing out of it when you're talking purely sort of distortion and focal range, sort of if you're on a crop sensor, 35 is probably as wide as you want to go, because that then translates to a 50 and
50
on a full frame, and then from there you sort of
go on further.
It's from there you start to remove the heavy distortion you get from wide angle lenses. And it's not to say that wide angle lenses can't be used in portraiture.
They can be. There's lots of creative uses to it. Like for a street style, you kind of want to show off a little bit where they are.
Yeah.
And they can be used. I use a 24 quite often, especially when I'm shooting street. But when you're doing like a waist up shot, that's going to distort your subject quite a lot.
Yeah. So if we're starting with a classic portrait, we want to be going sort of 35 or 50. Anything longer than that, like an 85 or anything like that. And so we've got our lens. We've got our camera. What are some things to think about in terms of the composition when taking that photo? Like, is there anything to be said about shooting really high or shooting really low, or how are you placing the subject in the frame? Can you talk about some of those sort of fundamentals and sort of
I try and shoot at
rules?
eye level. I try and shoot at eye level, Ben, and there's something about eyes in portraiture that speaks a lot. So I try and keep the camera always at the eye level of the model. I'm quite tall, I'm 6'3", so I often need to bend down and shoot for any person that I'm shooting. But I try and keep it at eye level. And then the basic compositions of photography, your rule of thirds, that comes into picture as well. So you place the subject on the rule of thirds, and that's when you get the most interesting perspectives, I feel. So the rule of thirds and shooting at eye level would be the 2 tips, I would say.
And what does shooting not at eye level do, just so people can understand? Like, if the rule of thumb is shoot at eye level, what does shooting outside of that do for a photo?
When you're kind of shooting down, it just looks weird. Like the person is looking up, the chin looks all weird. So you kind of want to have that chin and the shadow underneath it, just to give the face a shape. That's why most often you'll see people shooting at eye level. When you're shooting up, it almost shows like you look at the presidential portraits, people of power, they're usually shot slightly lower up. It's a good perspective. I don't know if it works for beauty. In my opinion, it doesn't, but it could work for you. So that's the other thing. Like, go around and play with it, see what works for you. And just because we are saying do this, don't do that. Like, try and play with it. Keep this in the back of your head. ultimately it's you, and that's all photography is about. It's what you want to showcase and what you want to portray. So yeah, keep these in mind, but feel free to play around with them.
Yeah. I guess another aspect of composition in portraits that I see sort of crop up a lot in beginner photos is the idea of headroom. Like, do you have a kind of, it's probably kind of just baked into your framework now, the idea of like how much headroom to give someone in a photo. But for someone who, I guess, is an absolute beginner, like what are some things to think about when, like, sort of just thinking about how much headroom to give? Obviously, you mentioned the rule of thirds, but just it's an area that can easily make a photo uncomfortable if someone's head is too close to the top of the frame or it's too far down. Is there a kind of a golden rule with that?
I try and keep room on either sides of the portrait, so just to give it a little more space, and that I think comes from shooting editorials. You almost want to give the magazine editor or the photo editor just a little bit of leeway on top and the sides to play with it. But if you just crop it like that it works for beauty, but as a portraiture you kind of want to see a little bit of their face and a little bit of space just to put it into perspective. Yeah. So it depends. Like if you're doing a beauty that's really close in, you often see just one side of the face really cropped in. So for beauty work, that works really well. So if you're shooting for advertising and beauty, that works well. Classic portraiture, I would leave some room on either side of the face. Yeah.
Cool. And so we've got our sort of composition relatively locked in for that kind of that classic head and shoulders. So, well, I guess, well, actually not entirely, because we talked about the top of the frame, but now I kind of want to talk about the bottom of the frame. Where exactly are you cutting people off? If we've got,
I almost go to the shoulders like that, pretty much at the shoulder length. For people who are listening, it's just below your shoulders. That's when you crop it off.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got sort of head and eyeline. So we're shooting at eyeline. We've got our sort of from our shoulders up to our head and a bit of room around our head, and we want our eyes relatively on that top sort of third
top
of the
line
frame.
of the thirds, yes.
The top line of the top third. Okay, so that's a nice, easy set of rules for someone to follow for a basic kind of nice head and shoulder portrait. Just in terms of the composition of it, we'll go into lighting and posing later in the show. But one other aspect I wanted to touch on in terms of composition is we've got a nice head and shoulders. What about a full body? If we want to sort of step back and take a nice full body shot of someone, maybe showing off their outfit, or we want just a full body shot. What are some of the composition things you're doing with that? Are you shooting a little lower? Are you still staying at eyeline? Are you giving the same amount of room to the feet as you are to the head? What are some of the things you're thinking about there?
So with full length shots, you almost I'll take an example for street style. For example, you kind of want to show off where they are, what they're wearing, and what the day was like. So I step back. You're trying to get a little bit more on the headroom, just showing off a little bit more of the street. On the sides, you're showing off more of the street, and then a full outfit. Shooting slightly lower, even waist level, gets you some really good shots. Try and stay, again, waist level and up from there, and that gives you some really nice shots. Get a little bit of the street as well, so it gives you perspective on what the day was like, what they were wearing, where they were, things like that. And similar in studio, so you kind of want to be waist level and higher where you want your camera to be, and that's where you take it from.
Okay,
and
cool.
Same with the focal lengths, you try and want to be 35 and above for this.
Yeah. But you were saying with the street style portraits, if you wanted to get a little bit quirkier with it, you could start to go a little bit wider for
Lower,
those full
wider.
frame, lower and wider.
Well.
Yeah. But definitely, you don't want to go up shooting down.
It works sometimes.
It works sometimes,
depending on the person. Yeah.
Okay. When you say depending on the person, what would be a time that you would shoot up and down?
Works really well for a person who are slim. I wouldn't try it for someone as wide as me.
Cool. Okay. Awesome. So we've got those sort of two basics of our kind of portrait shots. We've got the head and shoulders. We've got the full length, which is shot slightly lower, so you get that nice sort of looking up at them, feeling of power, etc. Are there any other sort of go-to compositions that you might suggest people could play around with?
Shooting lower makes someone look really tall as well. So when you're shooting down and looking at them, especially for full length,
Yeah.
shooting from slightly lower makes them look taller. So if that's a look you're going for, you could always try that as well.
Okay, cool. Nice. Fantastic. All right. Well, so we talked about composition. We're going to start to go into lighting now. And as this is a sort of show of starting with the basics, I thought we could start about talking with natural lighting. So no flash, just starting with natural lighting. What are some of your rules of thumb when working with natural light? How do you like to use it for portraits?
To begin with natural light, you kind of want to shoot on an overcast day. You get that nice, beautiful, soft lighting, and it makes skin types look good. It just works in your favor. The harsher shadows can look good depending on the time of the day. You don't want to get someone that raccoon eyes just because the sun is right above your head. You could carry a reflector with you, which are really cheap to buy. You could buy one for $20 and you get the white and the silver, depending. You could bounce some light back into their faces, and that works for you. But I like shooting on an overcast day. It acts like a giant softbox, and you get that really nice diffuse soft light, and it just makes your skin and everyone just flattering light, basically.
Yeah. Do you prefer even so we're going for overcast, but are you still are you backlighting a subject? Are you front lighting? Are you side lighting? Like, how are you using that? Because the even when it's overcast, the light still has a direction. So how are you kind of
A little
thinking
bit of
about
direction.
that?
Yes, you're right with that. Yeah. So I kind of always have front lighting on this.
Front lighting.
You
Okay.
could get creative and get backlighting, but you're almost going to get a silhouette, so you can't tell who the person is or what outfit they had.
Yeah.
And so front lighting always works in your favor. You could get creative and play around with backlighting and get silhouette. So either way on what you're going to go for and what look you're trying to achieve with it.
Yeah. But so sort of slightly more front lighting, so we're lighting our subject. And using the clouds as a giant softbox.
Softbox, yeah.
Just, push a nice billowy, soft light on the front of our subject. Cool. Okay. Any other sort of technique? Like, do you like to work around sort of golden hour or anything like that? Sort of sunset? Do you use sunset at all in your sort of natural light?
It works in your favor, especially when you're shooting in the city. You can get creative between buildings, get those nice harsh shadows, get a subject in between there, and get creative with it. And you get some really good light at golden hour, like you said, and that can work in your favor. I would start off with shooting overcast days and then slowly getting into it once you understand what your light is doing. Then get into the harsher side of things, and you get some beautiful portraits at end of the day. Basically, you have that 30-minute window where you can just get creative and get shot. So I would start off with shooting overcast, get to understand your subject, get to understand your camera, get comfortable with it, and then venture out and shoot golden hour.
Cool. Awesome. Okay. So we've experimented with some natural lighting. Before we go into off-camera flash, actually, you mentioned the reflector. What are some basic sort of reflector techniques that people can start to play around with?
What I usually do is when the sun is right above your head, I try and place it in front of the subject. So it's bouncing a little bit light back on their face. You kind of want to stay with the silver one. Silver side of the reflector or the white reflector, depending on the day. If it's too bright, stick to the white. If it's overcast, stick to the silver. So it's just bringing back a little bit of their light, a little bit of that sparkle in their eyes, where the reflector pops a little bit of color. And that looks really good. So reflector is a cheap way, and I'm sure any portrait photographer would have a few lying around in their car, around their house. So they're a cheap way to modify light. And even at home when you're shooting by your window, you could always put a reflector and just bounce that little bit of light back into the subject. So that's a cheap way of getting good light. If you don't have a reflector around, piece of cardboard, put some white paper on it. Anything lying around, basically, even your bed cover or something like that could work well.
Yeah, nice, fantastic. And is there a wrong way to use a reflector in terms of like whether you're bouncing the light sort of down on top of them or up from underneath them? Is there kind of any no-nos with using a reflector? It's
really hard to go wrong with a reflector. I would just say be careful with it because the sides are almost like spring-loaded. So just be careful with it when you're working with the subject. Don't go close to them and open it up.
Oh, yeah.
Because, so just be careful. I don't think there is a wrong way to use it. You could use the black side of the reflector and block off the light silver to bring back the light golden depending on the hour. So I don't think you can go wrong with the reflector, to be honest. Just try and see where your light is coming from. Get it on the reflector and then bounce it back to the person.
Okay, Cool, fantastic. Okay, so we started to play around with reflectors. We're now bouncing the light around. We're getting light coming from multiple directions. We're going to take that to the next level now and to talk about off-camera flash, because that's kind of when we start to get into, real, portrait photography. You got off-camera flash, you got modifiers. So, what's some of the real basic entry-level gear and techniques when dipping your toe into off-camera flash?
So I think all of us start off with a speed light first, and Canon makes some really good speed light. You have the 580EX, which you can find really good on Marketplace on Trade Me. I don't know if Canon's going to like us promoting that stuff, but that's a good way to get into it. And then slowly from there on, you can go on to the 600, which has a radio trigger built in, so makes it nicer, and you can use it wirelessly. With the 580EX, you would have to buy a trigger for it. And so you can move it away from your camera. Most people start off with the flash on the camera itself, but slowly you can get into off-camera flash. You buy a trigger which transmits the signal, and then the flash fires when your shutter fires. So a 580EX or a 600 would be a good place to start, both made by Canon. You can find a 580 cheap these days, $250, $300. That's a good place to get into it. Reliable flashes, I have mine for almost 12 years and it still works brilliantly. So
Nice. And when you're working with off-camera flash, are you still using natural light, like say as a light source, and then bringing in the off-camera flash as an additional source, or like what's some of the ways you're sort of thinking about using, like what role does the off-camara flash play in the image?
So I'm just going to get slightly technical with this
please
one.
do.
So when you go to flashes, your aperture is controlling the flash power, like how intense your flash is controlled by your aperture. And your ambient light, which is your natural light, is controlled by your shutter speed. So depending on how you want to balance it, you can go slower shutter speeds, you get more of the natural light, more power on the flash. That's as technical as flash is. So most people get that confusing. I'm like, why is the flash so high? Put your aperture down, and that's when you're going to get lesser power on the flash. So that's basically starting point. You can have it you can mimic what sunlight looks like and have a flash right above and pointing down at the subject. You can have it right next to them with a big deflector in front of it, or your own reflector that you had. It comes with a translucent side. Create window light with it. So there is lots of things that you can do with a tiny flash.
And is there, like when you're using, say you're using the an off-camera flash outdoors, it's an overcast day, like we mentioned before. Your overcast natural ambient lights coming from the front. Are you putting your flash in the same place? Is the flashlight coming from the same direction? Is it coming from a different direction? Are you going to sort of change around and have the natural light from the back and have the flash from the front? Like, is there anything that changes like that when you start to incorporate
depending
flash?
what you're trying to achieve, Ben. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, do you want a backlit photo? You can put the flash behind them and just get that halo effect. You'd see a lot of wedding photographers do that, especially at night when it's raining. They get that flash from the back, they get all the raindrops. It looks magical and it looks beautiful like that. So you can put a flash at the back, one in the front, light it up. But if you're shooting outside on an overcast day, a reflector is more than enough. So just because you have a flash, you don't need to use it. You need to understand what tool to use when. So if it's a nice overcast day, I would just take a reflector. Less hassle, quicker to set up.
Nice. Cool. Okay. Fantastic. And in terms of some of the sort of, look, so I'm just sort of like looking at your website here. Just sort of a common look for a portrait is the kind of the classic sort of editorial, crisp, bright look. If someone wanted to recreate that with, say, just a speed light that's off camera and some basic diffusers, what might they sort of look at trying to do to mimic a sort of a classic kind of bright editorial feel?
Perfect. So with that, you can have a shoot-through umbrella, which is, again, a cheap accessory to buy. You can pick up one up for $20 to $30. Put your flash in it. So it's shooting through the shoot-through umbrella. So what that does is diffuses the light. It's nice and soft, and have that on top of the person. So it's coming down at a 45-degree angle So say where you're sitting, it's about 2 feet away from you, coming down at you from a 45-degree angle. So there's this nice, beautiful, soft light coming from the top. You could put in a reflector at the bottom, and that's catching some of the light and putting it back on your face. That's a basic clamshell lighting setup, and that's what you'll see with most painters using. Gives you that nice, soft light on your face, even lit up, because you're getting basically a sandwich of light.
Yeah.
And it gives you that nice soft light because you have that big umbrella with you. It's diffusing the light before it comes to the subject, and that white reflector at the bottom is bouncing some of that light back and gives you that nice light that's wrapped around you. So that's a good place to start. Yeah.
Fantastic, man. That was a great explanation. I think that's giving people a few tools to start to play around and understand quality of light, some of those directions, some of those fundamentals, in understanding what light can do when it comes from different directions, how you can soften it and use really simple things like cheap umbrellas and reflectors to soften and diffuse light and bounce it around. And when you start to play around with bouncing light all over the show, you start to get some really interesting looks, and that was when you start to delve into those more like editorial and sort of professional looking portrait photos, when you're starting to manipulate light and bounce it all around and do some cool, interesting
one
things.
exercise I always did. Like back when I was starting off, I would pick up magazines, look at pictures, and try and understand how the light was created. A quick giveaway is looking at the eyes, because that's reflecting where the lights are coming from.
Yeah.
So that's one exercise that I think most of us should do more often. Open up a magazine, look at a picture, see where the light is coming from, try and understand how it was created. And that's how I started off, just trying to understand. But nowadays you have Pinterest, and most photographers share their lighting setups. I try and do that on my Instagram as well, share as much as possible. I think being self-taught, I feel I should share what I know. So yeah, I put behind the scenes. There's lots of Pinterest, so try and understand what other photographers are doing, and that often gives you ideas on what you can implement as well.
Yeah, fantastic, absolutely. And I think that's a great little technique about looking at the eyes. You can totally see all the little white dots, see what
Specks of
thing
lights,
whether you got a little square dot, or you can see the little bits
Around
types of reflectors photographers are using, definitely. Cool. Okay. Well, sort of just a few more things to wrap us up on this sort of beginner episode is a couple of things. We've got our sort of camera stuff. So we've got our lenses, our lighting, things like that. So, but I just wanted you to briefly touch over some of the more soft skills of portrait photos. So first one I'd get you to sort of give us some real basic breakdowns on is sort of what people can think about in terms of locations. So when you're looking around for a nice place to take a photo, headshot, full body, a few different sorts of shots, what are you looking for in terms of a location? Are you thinking about textures? Are you thinking about colors? Are you thinking about where the light's coming from? What are some things people can start to put in their brain as like that's going to be a nice place to take a photo?
Yeah, I'm going to take a step back, and I really like when you call it soft skills. That's exactly what it is. Like, portraiture is more about the soft skills rather than the technical side of things. You kind of want to get the person comfortable. That's when you're going to get your beautiful shots that you're trying to get. So in terms of location, when I'm shooting with a team, I try and see where it's closest to park, whether there's a toilet available close by. Because if you're with a team and a longish day, you kind of need to take things into consideration. Then comes your permits. So if you're trying to shoot for an editorial or a advertising campaign, you need permission from the city council to shoot there. So that's a big part of it as well, whether the client has the budget to go that mile and take permissions and all of that, or whether they have a friend's house that we could shoot at. So depending on what you're trying to shoot, that's what you need to take into consideration. If you're just shooting by yourself with a model, go out, look at what you want to create, whether you want to create some of those classical portraits which look quite European. You can find buildings and snippets of it and just use that, and you can make it look like those classic portraits that you've seen in magazines from Europe and places like that. So there are buildings in Auckland where you can make it look like that, whether you want a clean backdrop, whether you want water in your background, whether you want it in a forest or something like that. So it all depends on what you're trying to create. But the one thing I do is, even when I'm going for walks, you'll have pictures of small places on my phone where I want to go back and shoot again. So keep an eye open. You never know when you're going to find a cool location, and it could work depending on the time of the day you're there. So
Fantastic. And I think it's definitely a thing people with, like, who are, you know, photographers and stuff, who are out, who location scouting is part of their sort of toolboxes. You're always like taking little photos on your phone when you're out, going, oh, I'll make sure I lock that away. You drop a little Google
and it makes
pin
it
or
so
something.
much easier,
like,
especially with newer phones. Like, you scroll up and you see where the location was, so you don't even have to remember. Like, sometimes you used to look at pictures on phone previously and you're like, where did I take that? But now you can get the exact GPS location on it, Android or iPhone or anything, and you can always go back and shoot there. So that comes in handy.
Totally. Cool. Okay, so we've found a nice location for our photos. We've got our friend or our model or a significant other that we're taking a photo of. Last thing I want to kind of touch on is the other kind of main soft skill for a portrait photographer, and that's like posing and directing. So what's some real basics for, especially aimed at someone who is not only a beginner photographer but working with a beginner model? What are some things you can sort of get someone comfortable with, some real easy go-to poses? Are there some things that sort of just work, you know, right off the bat?
So this is a tip I picked up in one of the podcasts or a book, I can't remember where, but calling the person by their name instantly puts them at ease. So referring to them by their first name always puts a person at ease straight away. So I'm like, Ben, this is what we're going to do today. So when you start off, I usually tell them what we're trying to achieve, what you're going to be starting off with. So I'm like, Ben, I'm going to shoot your portrait today. It's going to be used in magazine X. I'm going to start with waist up shots. You're going to be looking towards the camera, nice and relaxed. I'll get you to smile later on, look away. So talk to the person. That's the most important thing. They need to feel comfortable. The worst thing is when a person is just pointing a big ass camera at you, turning a few buttons, looking at the picture, looking back at you. You think, am I doing something wrong, or is he just trying to figure it out? So communication is the biggest thing. That's going to instantly put them at ease. Even if a pose is not working, just don't say it's not working. Can we try this? Can we try your shoulder towards the camera? Put them at ease. And that's when you're going to get some of the good portraits, I would say.
Nice. And I totally agree, by the way. The getting people comfortable is, you know, that's going to get you 80% there to getting a nice photo, regardless of what they're doing with their, like, poses.
Posing. Yeah.
If they're comfortable and happy and relaxed and having a good time, that's going to lead to a good photo.
Yeah.
When I kind of want to, like, take us back to the beginning of the show when we're talking about that classic, like, head and shoulders portrait shot. Yes. Is there a kind of a right or wrong way to get people to stand for that? You know, because I notice often with those sorts of photos, people's heads or body are sort of twisted in a certain way. Is there a reason you wouldn't shoot someone just straight, you know, shoulders square on?
Straight on makes you just look wider. So when I sit like this, it just makes my shoulders look wider. Like that instantly works better. So you kind of want to angle one of the shoulders towards the camera and take it from there. Shooting beauty, it's more of straight on. So that's what you get. Like, beauty is always straight on. With portraiture, wide shoulders, get one shoulder towards the camera, creates those lines, and it makes the portrait interesting straight away. The one flat line from straight on just doesn't work. Like, it just looks like a passport picture. So try and play with one shoulder towards the camera, looking around, stuff like that. Works pretty well.
Fantastic. Cool. All right. Well, I think we've gone on quite a good little journey of some basics of portrait photography. Would you maybe just sort of let's sort of go on a bit of a recap on some of the techniques we've sort of talked about for people to take away. So starting right off at the beginning of the show, we talked about composition, and some of the key takeaways you mentioned was shooting at eye level for those head and shoulder shots.
Yes.
And then when you start to step back and go for a full body, you can start to actually drop the camera down a bit lower.
Waist level, shoot up. If you even want to go, you can go straight to the ground, make the person look really tall, depending on what you're trying to get. Yeah. So feel free to play around, see what works for you.
Definitely. And then as we start to delve into lighting, starting with an overcast day, having the light coming from the front of your subject, and then as you get more comfortable with natural lighting, start to bring in a reflector, use that to bounce the light back up into your subject, and then as you get comfortable with that, we start to bring an off-camera flash. You can start to play around with the clamshell technique that you talked about before, where you've got your reflector from the bottom, your flash with some kind of diffuser, like an umbrella, from a 45-degree angle, like you mentioned, and you're creating that kind of book or clamshell.
That's correct. So you're getting that light from both ends, and just because it's both diffuse, just gives that really nice effect on the skin and portrays that really well.
Fantastic. And then so you've got your...
You spoke briefly about lens choices as well. 50 and above,
of course.
35
50 and above. Yeah. And then if you wanted to start to get a bit quirkier, you can start to go wider for those full body shots. But those longer focal lengths are a really nice, safe go-to to keep people's bodies and faces undistorted. And it's just a really nice, flattering look. Cool. Okay. Well, that's, I think, a great sort of list of techniques and tools and tips for people to start to go away with and have a play around.
And like we said, keep looking at magazines, fill in that visual diary. So anytime someone goes, I need a quick picture, you always have those 5 or 6 shots back in the head. Yeah. Like, this is what I'm going to do. This is the pose. That's the building I'm going to shoot it at. So look at as many pictures as possible. Try and understand where the light is coming from. So you have that in the back of your head and it's easy to recreate it. So fill up that visual diary.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, thank you, Anu, for coming on the show this week. Next week, we're going to be jumping straight back in with you and doing an intermediate show for everything we need to know for portrait photography for the aspiring professional. So we're going to be talking about things like more in-depth location scouting, full gear breakdowns, things like on-set etiquette and safety briefings, all the kind of stuff you need to know for your kind of your first paid gig or your first kind of foray into doing something for your portfolio. So join us next week for that. And other than that, thank you again, Anu, and we will see you again next week.
That was a pleasure. Thank you, Ben.
Awesome. All right. See you guys next week. Bye.